I'm not a musician, but I love music and listen to a lot of music. Um, and and like a lot of people, I'm sure, but in my head, I play a lot of music and I play a lot of rhythms, pieces of music that I'm absolutely sure help me when I write. And I write poetry, what we call poetry, but also prose, and I take my prose as seriously in terms of not only the choice of words and the balance of the sentences, but the rhythms in those sentences. There's rhythms, in natural speech that are beautiful and musical. So again, I'm not in any way formally trained in music or musical. I can't play an instrument, but I like to sing and I like to bring what I think are patterns of sounds and beats. We call them stresses often in poetry.
Okay.
Into the way I speak and write.
Mm.
I love music.
Yeah.
I'm not good at creating it, but I suck it all up.
I used to be musical. I used to play instruments, but then it takes a lot of work to be good. So now I support music.
Okay.
So yeah, I would say a musical.
I am. I was raised by a dad who had post-bop and cool-bop jazz playing all the time in the house. So it's kind of in us, in my family, and I play piano, kinda, keyboard in a band, play harmonica, and but I just started doing that in the last 5 years. Prior to that, I just have to say music has been a huge part of my life.
I've played various instruments all my life. I started playing piano and gave it up, I think, because I had mean piano teachers when I was little. I never sort of picked it up again. And then played the banjo for really some time. Played bluegrass music and with the band, with the band. And then I've always sung, and so I do now. I have a
Ancient poetry was clearly metrically regular and included rhymes and phrases that used assonance and alliteration, repetition of vowels and consonants and so on, so that it could be remembered and recited. Homer or the man or the people that made those poems, right, in ancient Greece, were, this is pre-writing. So they clearly had musical instruments. We're not quite sure what their music sounded like, but we have an idea what their instruments were like from images on vases and in mosaics and so on. And we have later translations. We have the work when it was written down finally, and we can hear that there's music in there. So these things were recited, and you had to remember it. It's like going to a concert and having a lot of lyrics to remember. So form is huge. Form is huge for centuries. And really in the late 19th century with Whitman and Dickinson and the French movements, there's a lot happening. A history of free verse is it's a history of free verse. It's an interesting series of pioneering breakthroughs where they're starting to let go of the meter, the regular meter. The iambic pentameter was just so dominant. Yeah, and that's a great question because right now we're at a place where poetry is really changing, and there are different kinds of poetry. I'm still like what I call a literary poet, and just in that, what goes on the page, the writing is number one most important. I like reading my poems. I like performing them, but I'm not a spoken word poet. And what is commonly understood now as spoken word or slam poetry is a bit different.
Okay.
And I'm open to it, and I can enjoy it, but often then those words become a little bit more like song lyrics, where the performance and the cadence of delivery is really very, very important. And the words have to be more accessible to an audience that they get it right away as you're saying it. Now, I'm not dissing it, but it's a different art form. So, yeah, I still work with the words on a page. That's most important to me.
I guess I've done both. I see it more on the page, I guess. Than, yeah.
I think that that it exists both ways. Poetry is meant to be heard rather than read, but it has to be written and read before it can be heard. So,
Right, but so you think the end product is being heard?
yes, I think that's the whole purpose of poetry. That poetry is and it's something that I teach in intro, that poetry was, the purpose of it was to be heard, not to be read. And I think that has different meaning depending on who reads it and how they read it.
It's fun to hear somebody else read your poem, because then it's like a song. It sounds different, you know. If you can change the tempo of something or emphasize different words. It's always shocking to me when somebody else reads aloud something that I wrote, because I guess it would be spoken, because I see it on the page, but when you're writing, I don't know about you, you hear it, because there are certain words you change because you have to say them out loud. And when you read them out loud, sometimes you have to change a word, because it's like, it doesn't sound right.
The form of the poem itself visually is on the page, just as you see it, has an aesthetic element to it that immediately announces it as a poem for the most part. And I think there's that's an important element of poetry that a lot of poets don't pay attention to, is the visual aspect. I know they understand it, but I don't know that they approach it with an artist's eye. So you can read it, and it's wonderful to read quietly, but truly to completely capture any poem, you should read it out loud.
Many poems, both that I've read and also that I've written, that I really feel as though they speak best in silence. And there are many, and I think, and they seem to me like a different kind of, really a very different kind of poem, are ones that I just always sort of, there are some that actually remain of my own, that are some of my favorite poems that I really actually don't even want in a book, because then people would be reading them and they have to hear them. So I don't even want them to be able to read them.
You said to me that in the absence of comfortable structures of meaning, whether they be religious or political, philosophical, when there's chaos in the world, the arts will reflect that. And I'm not saying that free verse is chaotic, but it's definitely saying these old patterns are no longer doing it.
Right.
They're no longer saying what I need to say. There's typically in the arts a lot of parallelism. I don't know music like you do. You could teach me a lot, but I know a little about the visual arts and about poetry, and there's you can just see this fracturing of those old classic academic forms in painting and in poetry to a kind of a reconfiguration. We got to try to find meaning here. We have to make some sense out of this. And there's a lot of play, which is great, and then there's a lot of just kind of also explosions, and splintering and discordant music and imagery. People thought, I thought painting was supposed to be beautiful. This painting by Edvard Munch is not beautiful. It's terrifying.
Right.
Well,
and then he's like, I thought the world was supposed to be beautiful.
Yeah, there you go. I was disappointed by the world. So my art is a little disappointing.
I definitely do, mainly because I teach how to read poetry, how to analyze poetry, and so I absolutely notice the whatever type of pattern or lack of pattern there is in any poem. I believe that every song is a poem. They're not all good. Just like there's poetry that's not good.
I do. And one thing that I realized that I don't really care for is poetry slams, because they, to me, the words are not as beautiful. It feels like it seems like there are trends. You know how there are trends, musical trends, and then there are reading trends, and even acting voice trends. And I don't like the current trend of how poetry is read right now.
I think about the way that even the fact that we're even sitting here having a conversation about that is a result of the way in which, when that poetry, lyric poetry is called lyric because it was originally always connected with music. In the ancients, there was not poetry without music. It was all part of a spoken oral tradition. It's hard for me to think of poetry separate from music.
Window box. Peanut buttered pine cones, seeds, all shapes and sizes, and hanging clear glass vials of sweet red nectar bring nature to my grandfather. He talks about domestic problems and lost nuts with bushy-tailed gray squirrels. Robins and finches tag team crows and jockey for perfect snacking perches. Hovering hummingbirds flicker around and take turns sipping nectar while Grandpa watches from his power lift chair. He can still see the flowering plums and weeping willows stand against a backdrop of rain-soaked gray.
Well, I think visual art's in there too, especially with poetry, maybe less with music. But absolutely. I don't think there's a boundary. Now, there are artists that are good at one thing. But I always say anybody who's bright enough can do pretty much anything artistically. They have to then be disciplined.
That has been very much my experience too. Very much my experience. And I actually start in the arts. I actually started as a visual artist. I can't remember not painting, and I can't remember not singing. All those things, and so in a way, the medium of poetry came later. But there's something about that. I think that triad that became and still is very dynamic to me. They inform each other in ways that, and this is what I think you're talking about, they are all connected with the same field.
My answer is yes. That I do think there's evidence of an underlying aesthetic vision, or it's been called many things over many centuries. You mentioned Joseph Campbell, and revisiting those Jungian notions of archetypes and a shared collective conscious or unconscious that we tap into in deep, profound ways, like our arts. And I don't know if that's the suitable metaphor or the correct modern psychological, psychiatric, neurological, sociocultural way of saying it, but it seems to be something going on there. We are humans.